Don't go out with hearing people? That's funny. I can't read this.
Hi, I'm Zeinabu Irene Davis, Director of Compensation. I'm here at the IndieWire studio in New York City to talk about my film on the Toolkit podcast.
Before we get into compensation and the restoration, this is the first time we've ever had a chance to talk. You went to film school, got your MFA in UCLA kind of late 80s, right? Is that
Yes.
Yeah, right. So I'm always fascinated by that time. I don't know if this is a name that we've imposed or that you guys imposed, the LA Rebellion, and that what was going on in that scene, in that world right now? Because I have to imagine that ethos has kind of something that you carried with you as a filmmaker, right?
Yes, definitely, Chris. I am a proud member of the LA Rebellion.
You guys call it that, right?
Well,
yeah.
There is contention about the name.
Okay, all right.
Critic Clyde Taylor was the one who coined the term back in 1986.
Okay.
And some of the filmmakers like that term and some don't. I actually did a documentary on the LA Rebellion filmmakers called Spirits of Rebellion. Mm-hmm. I personally like the name.
Yeah.
But my colleagues, not so much.
Right. It's some of the first Black graduates of the UCLA film program, but there's also a sense of collaboration and a lot of great individual artists have come out of there, but there was kind of a spirit to it, right?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the LA Rebellion really kind of begins right after the Watts riots or Watts Rebellion uprising in 1965. And then there's people like Charles Burnett and Larry Clark. Charles Burnett, who now has a restoration, Annihilation of Fish, but is known for Killer of Sheep and To Sleep with Anger. And then Larry Clark, Passing Through, and Billy Woodbury, Bless Their Little Hearts. Then the women come in the 70s. And the women are Julie Dash, Daughters of the Dust, Barbara McCullough, Water Ritual, Alile Sharon Larkin, Your Children Come Back to You, and then me later on. But there's, and there are many more, at least 50, 60 filmmakers who kind of identify with this group of filmmakers. And I think the most important thing that we brought to filmmaking is a collaborative process. We really worked with each other and we worked on each other's films. We weren't like the great director. We like, oh, you need sound today? Okay, I'll help you do sound. Or okay, I'll help you do lighting or camera, whatever it was that needed to be done. We often would all help each other to do. And then it was very insistent on making sure that our community was represented in the way we saw our communities. So that everyday quotidian life is definitely a part of the ethos of the LA Rebellion filmmakers' work. And in addition to that, we use our community to make our films. Right. So you'll see in my films and particularly in Charles Burnett's films and Jamal Fanaka's films, we have our family members that are actually doing roles or playing some part on screen, but then we also might have people who are behind the screen as well. I tease my screenwriter husband, Mark Cherry, because he's in like 4 or 5 different films of mine. So he has more credits than some actors do. But, he's there and he's helping. He's on set. So he assists with whatever needs to get done.
And there's a little bit of that in terms of the origin, tapping into that, the origins of compensation, right? Because some of this came from, you had a process of working on characters, right? And a good friend of yours, we could talk about this, and some of this came from a journal entry for a character or something. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. The previous featurette that I made, A Powerful Thing, was shot in Yellow Springs, Ohio. I was teaching at Antioch College at that time. Mm-hmm. And the lead actress from that film, Asma Faye Jimmy, who's a professional dancer, was not an actress. She's what we call a social actor, someone who does in real life what they're going to be doing on the film. Mm-hmm. But Asma was not used to hurry up and wait of cinema, right?
That's always the problem when you bring in the...
Yeah. So it's like, well, what do you do? But I wanted to keep her in character. So we had her journal as her character while she was waiting on set. And Mark suggested that we give her the poem Compensation, which was written by Paul Laurence Dunbar about 1905, 1906, right before he passed away from tuberculosis. And Asma is a writer also. And she responded because as a Black woman dancer in Brooklyn in the early 90s, there was a lot of HIV/AIDS in her community.
Well, that's when the people in the arts community in New York really, I mean, we lost almost a whole generation.
Exactly. And so she responded so beautifully to that poem Compensation and talked about that loss from her in her dance community of people who they were losing out. And they were losing men, but they were also losing women. So it was important. It was like, oh my God, this is like really, it came from her heart. And so it inspired Mark to actually go and write something based off of what Asma told us in that journal entry, and then what Dunbar's experience was before he passed away, because of course he was like the big celebrity of his time period as well. So Dunbar's poem became the basis for the film, and then Mark expanded it so that it would have a connection from the early part of the 20th century with the characters dealing with tuberculosis, and then at the end of the 20th century with the characters dealing with HIV/AIDS. So it was a way for us to kind of talk about like the pandemics of those times. And I think that was like really the connecting piece that brought those two love stories together for each of those characters.
It also supplies an interesting structure, where you can pull out, obviously there's the tuberculosis AIDS connection, but really it becomes a lot more about being able to, and it feels like this wonderful device for you and Mark to pull out subtleties of, just everyday life, but also how much these time periods aren't that separate. They aren't that different, and especially in the kind of ordinary day-to-day life of Black people, right?
Yes, definitely. And that's part of, like, I think my films in general, when I do narrative films, I'm trying to show ways that people communicate with each other, and then also like these moments of intimacy that you don't always see like in more mainstream films, and so that's important to me, like those little small gestures or those looks that happen between the actors. And you can't get any better than looks between John Earl Jelks and Angela Banks. I'm sorry.
Yeah. But there's also just something, I love films like this, but there is something about moving back and forth between them. Mm-hmm. You're drawn into it. You become almost more observant.
Oh, good.
I feel like, it's like you're seeing things in the 90s because of the way I saw things in the first decade of,
right.
You see these things, and it's just this wonderful structure, because sometimes those films they're asking you to see subtleties that aren't as plot driven. Sometimes
right.
they can. It's hard to sometimes get into them, and it's just this wonderful structure. Every time I see it, I get pulled more and more into it.
Thank you.
So the film, if my understanding is correct, and I think it is, the protagonist was not originally deaf, right?
You're correct.
And this came from, I believe you and Mark maybe saw Michelle A. Banks in a play or something. I wonder if you could talk about that, because I think your lead actress also brought in a whole different aspect of the narrative, right?
Yes, exactly. Totally changed the trajectory of the film. Mm-hmm. I was on a panel for ITVS, Independent Television Service. Then this was in the early 90s when they were located in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm reading like maybe 600 applications. I'm like, I need to do something else.
Oh, you're the one approving all the docs that
yes,
get on PBS.
Yes,
I know so many of our filmmakers get their ITVS funding, so I know.
Right.
Well, it's good to know that there's someone good. There's someone with some chops behind making these decisions.
I like to think so. Yeah. I like to think so. But we needed to do something else. Yeah. And there we looked in the free paper that was in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and there was a still image of Michelle in her one-woman play. And I was like, oh, Mark, look at this. I've never seen a Black deaf woman. I hadn't actually not really experienced deaf people before, other than Sweet Honey and the Rock, an a cappella group who always use ASL as a part of their performance. So it was like, this could be really interesting. And we went and we saw Michelle. I just had to take one look at Mark. He took one look at me and we're like, we got it. She's the one. She's the one. So luckily for us, we kind of like stalked her backstage. And then this is the point when, we didn't have cell phones to like communicate with each other. So, and there's no interpreters around. So I'm like talking to her like with a notepad or some piece of paper, whatever we had available, like probably the newspaper that we came to see her with, writing in the margins so we can like communicate. And luckily for us, she had some experience. She had worked on films with another deaf filmmaker, Anne-Marie Bryant, Jade Bryant, who also came to work on Compensation later on. But she had film experience, and she was a little bit familiar with the process. So thankfully, she said yes right on the spot. So we were like, yes. But that led to us like looking at the script and figuring out, okay, we need to bring her experience as a deaf person into the story somehow. And that meant we had to do research. We had to like make contacts in the community. We actually, Michelle introduced us to Christopher Smith, who plays the Bill Young character, the dancer, in the contemporary part of Compensation. He was a dancer. Okay, so we're gonna have dance in the film. So, and then I studied ASL for a little while, and also just we made connections with Black Deaf Advocates. It was a community group in Chicago, and went to some of their events and also incorporated some of their events in the film.
It's interesting because obviously I haven't read a draft of yours and Mark's script before this, or the outline or whatnot. But there's something about it sometimes when you think, if you were thinking about it from the outside, like incorporating something that big into this might feel like a whole nother thing. But the deaf aspect really seems to gel in work narratively with what you guys were already thinking about in terms of the structure, right?
Yes, definitely. Because, actually when you go back and do your film history, at least American film history, there was the inclusion of deaf actors in film. And not very many people know about that. But Lon Chaney was probably the most important example. Lon Chaney's parents were deaf. And part of him like creating those characters, that he's so famous for, was because he had this background from his parents as deaf performers for, vaudeville or for theater, so on and so forth, whatever the entertainment topics of that time was. So he was able to adapt and make those faces and expressions come alive when he was on screen. And so I think we need to remember that, sometimes the hidden history is really not so hidden if you really look, And so we wanted to make Compensation look like a silent film.
Because of that connection,
Yes.
It almost opened the door to embrace even more of,
Yes.
which is also the film of the era of when those characters lived, right?
Exactly. So we have the photograph of them going to the Nickelodeon, which existed in the Midwest before it exactly existed on the coasts. So those were important to me as well.
And there's like no dialogue, I think, for like the first 15, 20 minutes, something like that. It's remarkable. You don't even miss it, but
Thank you.
That almost embraces even more because you have to get into the rhythm of these like silent film devices. It's remarkable. And also, I love this too. They don't go see some D.W. Griffith movie. They go see. Can you talk a little bit about that film that they go see? Because you had to recreate that, right? But I mean, this is one, you were talking about film history. One thing about film history that and I'm embarrassed that in my 40s I'm learning this. There were Black films made by Black filmmakers for a Black audience, in particular in cities at this time. And it's a little bit largely because a lot of those films have been lost, but I mean, just that seems like a big thing here is just the act of going to see one of these films in Chicago, right?
Yes, which I wish I could have been like the little fly on the wall watching people when they first saw those films. But that was very important to me, was that, in film school, we're bludgeoned with D.W. Griffith as Black students.
Do you know there's cross-cutting between the two films, and that was how film was born?
Yes, that's what they say. But I have other ideas which we could talk about another
Professor
time.
Davis can come back on and talk about that. So
exactly.
We'll stay with compensation today.
Thank you. So, when we were in film school, they always talked about the techniques, but they never talked about the inherent racism that's in that film. That film does, glorify the KKK. And so I was very insistent with compensation that we were going to take that silent film form and do our part to kind of like expand this dialogue about like what cinema could do and what it doesn't do. And so it was very important for me to like use the historical photographs to create, 1900s, early 1900s Chicago, because I didn't have the resources.
Right. I want to come back to that too, because that's fascinating how you do that. Yeah.
And one of the ways to do that was to do the research and to like look at old newspapers from that time period. And Chicago Defender had the description of what the Railroad Porter was about. A Railroad Porter was a film that William Foster, one of the very early Black filmmakers, 1911, 1913, actually did. But like you said, the film's lost because,
So you kind of made your version of that based on the description that was in the Chicago paper.
Exactly, except I added the Zeinabu twist, which is that the girl has a gun, as well as the two guys.
That does fit, yes. Okay. Yes.
That was not in the original description. I added that into the original description. So in that film, The Railroad Porter, there was a real Foster photo play. Mm-hmm. And the composer for compensation for the ragtime section, the period section, Reginald Robinson, he actually is the railroad porter in the film. And then two friends of ours who are activists in Chicago, Lisa Brock and Otis Cunningham, we shot at their house. We filmed at their house. Mm-hmm. So they allowed us to like also include them as part of the film process. And that role was easy because you could be as hammy as you wanted it to be. So it was fun to have them do that role.
I want to do a slight detour because we are talking about the silent film and the deaf character aspect of this into the compensation. I love that you're calling it a rejuvenation, not a restoration, which I love. I wonder if you talk a little bit because it struck me watching it as a few weeks ago. What you're able to do with captions now and open captions now, which was something that I think if I'd seen your film in 99 at the Toronto Film Festival, I wouldn't have had this same experience of what you're able to do with captions now, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, that's why we call it a rejuvenation, because a rejuvenation implies that the film is actually better than it was, or at least more complete than it was from the original restoration, So it's important for me that people understand it as a rejuvenation because it was shot on 16 millimeter black and white negative. And when we do the rejuvenation, you're able to see way more details with the visuals than we could with 16 millimeter. And you can hear the sound work that I did. I had 32 tracks in one part of the film.
Because of mono.
Because mono is it just squishes, it squashes sound. So you can hear all that work that we did, in Chicago. I spent 3 months on the couch, creating the sound design at night after the work of the regular customers was done. Here's this little independent filmmaker trying to like get this film done. So all this sound work that I did with Maestromatic, you can actually hear it now. And then finally with the captions, that was the godsend, was because back in 99, we were only limited to 2 lines of dialogue, 2 lines of captioning, 31 characters max. And so you had to condensed even the dialogue. You had to condense it so it would fit, and it had to be at the bottom center of the screen. But with this new technology in 4K, what we're able to do, along with assistance from a very important hard of hearing filmmaker, Allison O'Daniel, who did Tuba Thieves, she helped us like really create like the tableau of the scene to also include captionings in strategic parts of the frame.
Because you're using the upper parts of the frame as well
Exactly.
for like music and sound, right?
Yes. So we use upper left is music description, upper right is sound effects description, and then also Allison taught us as a team that we should put the captionings closer to the person who's speaking if it's a multiple character scene, so the deaf and hard of hearing know who's actually speaking. Because if you're in a long shot, which we are in some cases in compensation, especially in the scene where Melindy does the bartering with the women, you don't know which character is talking. We don't have close-ups. It's a long shot. And so having the captions closer to where the character is also helps them to understand exactly what's happening in the scene itself. We also did some immersive stuff with the captioning, and in the section that I call the pressure montage, in the contemporary section, that's the part that had those 32 tracks of sound. So we're able to actually go and play with making words be large, like capitalized, making them go backwards and forwards, making them like kind of like pop out and glow a little bit. We're able to use the technology to also make you feel what the characters are going through emotionally.
That's why I wanted to talk to you. I've always been pro captioning as a matter of inclusion,
Right.
But you've thought about this far more than I have. I had a very interesting experience watching your restoration, where as a hearing person, what you're describing in that captioning actually was something that had an effect on me. In my relationship to the characters, and which is something different. I'd always thought about it. I want captions so more people could see this movie, but that's something it does have an effect on the hearing audience, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the cool thing about it, is that the rejuvenation actually can inform even more audiences. So the rejuvenation, yes, is specifically designed with those captions so that deaf and hard of hearing people can understand more what is going on in the film, but it also helps hearing people to actually like, okay, pay more attention. Oh, these sounds are here. I wasn't thinking about that, or I didn't hear that part of that music before. I didn't think about the music in quite that way. And it was a really difficult process to decide, like, there's a lot of text in compensation already because you have to read title cards because that was the style when it was silent cinema. Right. But we also wanted to make sure that the language wasn't too burdensome, so people like, oh, I don't want to watch this film because I don't want to read anymore. But the marriage of using the captioning on screen and the intertitles really worked. And I think it makes you have a more you have a more immersive experience watching the film now, regardless of whether you're hearing or if you're deaf or hearing impaired.
Before we move on, because you brought up the sound, you did all this work back in the 90s to create all these tracks. Yes. And there's a thing here that I think is an important lesson to filmmakers. The reason you were able to then, that got squashed in the mono track. Now working with Criterion, you have this ability to have many more tracks and do that. Part of this is you actually held on to your work. Right. I saw in one interview you called yourself a pat rack, but I mean, that's what you kind of have to be as an independent filmmaker, is you got to hold on to that stuff, right?
Exactly. And that's what I want filmmakers to know, that we need to make sure that we take efforts now so that we preserve our film work, because if you don't, we're going to lose it and we won't be able to access it anymore. So like the organizations like Missing Films that have guidelines on their website to tell you what you should do when you're shooting your film,
Right.
or right after you've completed your film. Because we're like in this digital world. And yeah, if you put it on a hard drive, well, this hard drive from today is not going to be the same hard drive that you're going to have 5 years from now. So we need to make sure you move your stuff off to whatever formats. I think there's Missing Movies has it specifically on their website, but I think it's a linear digital format that you can use that lasts at least 30 years. Of course, film is still king because we know that lasts more than 100 years, but there are affordable options for us open to us now that we can use so that we can make sure that the work is preserved. And I mean, I didn't make a lot of films, but the films that I do make, I want to make sure there's a legacy behind it so that somebody wants to know what this woman did or what this team did way back when is still available.
I want to connect some dots here. You were working at Northwestern when you made this film, right?
Yes.
And so you have students on set.
Yes.
And then as we were talking about your actress, Michelle, and you actually incorporated both in cast and crew a lot of deaf technicians and also actors, right? And so there is this element of it's a unique. I don't think we think of independent films that way, as like this collection of. We have some students here. We've got people from your community, your filmmaking community, and then you also have, this deaf community. It's a unique group, I imagine, that you're going out and shooting this film with.
Yeah, but it's not that unique. I mean, people like collaborate in many different ways or elements. It's like, to me, it's more like it goes back to the ethos of the LA Rebellion filmmakers. You've involved whoever's around you, your community, in your work. And I'm a professor, so I want to pass this on to my students, and I want to give them practical experience. And it's a collaboration. Yes, I'm the director. I have a singular vision. But these are also artists. These are also collaborators. They bring things to you that you don't necessarily have in and of yourself. So I think it's important to think about film as that collaborative process. We are so lucky and privileged to be filmmakers because you can bring dancers, you can bring spoken word, you can bring lighting, you can bring camera work. You have all these expressions that you can get into this medium. And I think we take that for granted sometimes. And so I want to make sure that this knowledge that you have, or this power that you have to make these images, is something that like we share as filmmakers, but it's also things from our community that we can share as a community.
So help me with this. In '93, you shoot this movie, and I think it was a lot shorter, right? Is that correct?
Yes, Mark left a 28-page script on my side of the bed after I was gone away for a festival. So, but when we started to do it, I was like, oh, this is a lot longer than 30 minutes. And then once we realized, because we always knew that we wanted to have historical photographs in the film. So once I started going to those archival visits,
after the first initial shoot.
Yes.
And you start digging into so part of the lengthening of this is also is this archival process after the first principal photography, right?
After principal photography in summer of 1993. That's when I go back and start to look at the photographs that we're going to include. The film was already longer than we imagined anyway, but that archival research took time. And it took me 6 years to go out, because I teach during this academic year. So I was really going to do the archival research during the summers. The only place I could do it during the school year was at the Chicago Historical Society, because I lived in Chicago. But if I wanted to go to the Schomburg in New York, or if I wanted to go to the Moreland Spring Arm at Howard University in Washington, D.C., or Gallaudet, I had to do those at different times. And then incorporating that made it like, okay, we were kind of like pretty close to about 45 minutes here. That I added scenes with John, because John Earl Jelks was living in Chicago. So we added some additional shooting that would kind of flesh out the contemporary scenes. So the scene of him in the library, that was added after principal photography. And in fact, like there's a scene of him when he's going to take his ASL, American Sign Language classes. He's walking in front of a deaf church, but you don't see the ground when we're doing that. And that reason is because there's snow on the ground. So there's a film, rest of the film is shot this summer, but we shot that on a shoot like maybe I think December 95, 96. And it was, it was winter, it wasn't summer like the rest of the film. So it was incorporating more scenes that made the film flesh out to be a 90-minute film.
Did you always have this idea of how you were going to use that archival?
Yes.
Those stills, yeah. Because I don't mean, there's something simple and elegant and beautiful about it, but we don't really see that much, especially with building in some city sounds and living in these stills and letting the stills themselves be this kind of feel of bringing Chicago there together.
As a filmmaker, every time I make a film, I try to do something different than I did before. And one of the things, I took animation classes when I was at UCLA, but what I didn't get experience with was with the optical printer. And so I taught I moonlighted at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago so I could have access to their optical printers. And so that was a way for me to actually learn something new in the service of this film, Compensation, that I could add into the filmmaking process. So that, again, in the contemporary section, when I have the trains kind of going back and forth with each other, we shot that laying on the top of a station wagon underneath the L tracks in Chicago. But then I was able to play and go back and forth on the optical printer to make that even, richer experience, kind of bordering, quote unquote, experimental film.
With especially the Depression montage, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And trains were this super important thing that go through the film. The migration of African Americans from the South to the North by train. And then, transportation, even contemporary transportation, Malika and Nico are on the train track, on the L track stations at different times, experiencing different things.
And you're thinking Eisenstein. I saw that. I thought this was
Yes.
a critic. I thought this was a critic who did it, so I was going to dismiss it. But then I saw it was you. You were thinking Eisenstein with this.
Oh, heck yeah. Heck yeah. You got to go to the greats, You got to go to the greats.
So obviously the process from 93 to 99, the film evolves, grows. In 99, I want to make sure I have this right. You go to the Atlanta Film and Video Festival, and then you go to TIFF, and then Sundance 2000.
Sorry, I don't know how this got in there, but the Atlanta Film Festival is actually in 2000. Is a free paper that printed that, and they actually put the wrong year.
I was wondering how Atlanta got the premiere over.
Yeah.
Toronto's not usually you know what? After Atlanta shows it, we'll.
Yeah, no.
I was I wondered if they just were a lot looser then, but I guess
no.
not.
Come on now, they were not looser then. No. It was more, the film premiered at Toronto
99
in 1999, and then it played at Sundance, and then it went to the other festivals.
So what was the reception like?
The reception was good with audiences. I mean, I loved the audience. What filmmaker does not love audiences that are at Sundance and at Toronto? These are people who really love cinema.
They're coming and they're rooting for the film coming in.
Exactly. They are open. They're ready for things, so on and so forth. They weren't distributors. For the very reason that you were talking of the film, 15 minutes. With no dialogue. When we were doing the screenings, distributors were running out of the room because I didn't have any dialogue. And I was like, wait. It's, It had no interest in it at that particular time. But I think, now, because like you said already, we got used to watching films with captions. We got used to experiencing the frame in a more inclusive way. I think audiences are ready now to receive compensation in this rejuvenated format that didn't exist back in 1999.
Is this also the way that this? I mean, it's a great film, and the one thing it's depressing to me when distribution when they can't find a home for something like this. But the one thing that always gives me hope is things like this find an audience over time.
Yes.
Is this a film that was also a triumph of the educational video distribution? Is that how
Yes,
people saw it?
yes. Thank you for bringing that up because that is very important. All of my work is with educational distributors like Women Make Movies, Third World Newsreel, Cinema Guild. You know, if those institutions didn't exist, my films would have been lost, so to speak. Because as filmmakers, I don't want to have to deal with like doing everyday like invoices and whatever to what college or what community group is want to do it. I would like somebody else to handle that so I could keep being on the creative side of filmmaking. And so these organizations really, really saved my work and the work of so many filmmakers because they existed and they reached out to those audiences who wanted to see the film. So compensation stays alive because of Women Make Movies. Otherwise, it would have been in my closet or whatever, you know, or I'd have it screenings of it, but it would be very limited. I would not have been able to have it play on cable or eventually to Criterion Channel, where it ended up as part of this, you know, process of like kind of like coming back to life, so to speak.
Ash Clark, right? I remember he programmed it at BAM,
Yes.
and now he's over there, and so I imagine that's a big.
Yes, Ashley Clark is really one of the most wonderful curators of materials. I'm so glad that he's at Criterion right now because he's bringing a lot of films that, you know, people didn't get a chance to see. A lot of filmmakers were not able to have their work as well exposed as I was.
You had an observation out of the New York Film Festival that I had as well, which was that was a young crowd.
Yeah.
They, you know, and this movie is not only just finding it's, you know, sometimes with cinephiles, it's, you know, yeah, they'll eventually find it and stuff, but it tends, you know, but this is like a young crowd that is like going to see, like New York Film Festival is not generally a young audience, and that was a young audience in that crowd.
I know. I was like shocked. I was so excited and happy to see, you know, 20-somethings and 30-somethings. I'm thinking it's going to be the gray hair crowd like me or whatever. But no, they're looking for something different. That's the thing. It's like, I think there's like, kind of like, if you're going to go to a movie, you know, if you're going to pay, you know, X amount of dollars to go see something live in person, you want it to be an event, or you want it to be like something that you would not necessarily experience just watching on your computer or watching it, you know, on your big screen TV, whatever it is. So the fact that one of the successes of compensation for me is that it does bring people together. And I particularly love it when there are deaf, hard of hearing, and hearing people in the audience, because we don't have a lot of opportunities for us as different communities to get together. And this is one of those times, especially when we're able to have Q&A with a live audience, that people get to see like different communities and get to talk and learn with each other and share, like, we're all human. We all experience the same things, but it's like, oh, I can talk to you, but I can talk to you in a different kind of way, or I can communicate with you I never thought I could before. That's like amazing. And I mean, that's the beauty of like film. It's like bringing it all together. It's like, yo, whoa, this is what we want to do. And the fact that young people are like willing to watch a black and white movie with quote unquote unknown actors, you know, and experience this film. I won, man. I won. It's taken, you know, my brother who's in the film, he's the Tyrone character.
Oh, okay.
My brother Kevin Davis is in the film. I told you, LA Rebellion filmmakers, we put our families in there. My dad is in the film. He was one of the spectators in the the Bill Young performance, so you can see the back of his big head in the film. And he was in A Powerful Thing. He played the parent, the dad in A Powerful Thing anyway. So my brother and him had this like, they would rib me because it's like, well, how come you put Daddy in the film? You didn't put me in the film. And so like, okay, we got you. And so the beauty of having all these different communities participate in the film make it accessible for so many people that just would not necessarily want to take part in going to, see a film. So I'm grateful that it's appealing to young folks as well as, older folks who may have seen it before.
Older folks, like, we can still go see it.
Yes,
we can still go see it.
Please go see it. Please go see it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for coming in and talking about it.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really enjoyed this.